School Day Memories. I want to provide some context for you and background because there is a method in my madness for how I put this together. We have in our archives down in the basement over 90 oral history projects. And what I mean by that is in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, older members of Eastham's community were interviewed about growing up in Eastham, their lives in Eastham. And many of them spoke of going to school here. I have to say also, as part of that context, my mom went to school here in that schoolroom. And I see many faces here whose moms or dads went to this school. And so it has a really special place in our hearts. Those who spoke of the schoolhouse when they were interviewed, that all got written down on card catalog. And we still use a card catalog here. One of our goals is to digitize that, but it's not there yet. So we went through the card catalog looking for any reference to the schoolhouse. And then we went to the tape scripts of the oral interviews and read through those tape scripts of people who had talked about the schoolhouse. And then we chose some, and many of the memories were shared memories. They were the same memories, but different takes on the things that they had experienced here through the years. And because none of the memories came with visuals, we went through the archives and found a visual to match it to the memory so that it would make a coherent story for you to hear this evening. So before going back 100 years, because the first student that I'll be talking about was in the really early 1900s. Nope, I'm going to change that. The first student it wasn't a student, I'm going to talk about a teacher and a memory. And this is because 2 days ago I got an email, and it was Tom Muscura, and I thought, that name seems familiar. And he said, we met you last year. We asked you about our grandmother, Hattie Goddard, because we thought she was telling stories when she said she taught at the Central School in Eastham, and she went down to see a ship that had washed up on the shore. And he was looking for either corroboration that she was telling a story or that she wasn't. And Alfred and I, he's my brother and he works in the archives with me, went through all of the old town reports, and lo and behold, Hattie Goddard taught at this school in 1901, and there was a shipwreck during that time. And we even found where she boarded. She boarded with a family 2 doors down Salt Pond Hill. And so I wrote back, they visited, and they're coming back next week. So and her brick, he bought a brick for her and we put it in the walk, and there it is. And so I'll be really excited to see him this year. Okay, I promise that's my only aside for the whole evening. But if you know me, we'll see. Okay, we're going to go back 35 years to a school reunion in 1989. And some of you are pointing and going, there's Mom, there's Dad, and you're absolutely right. So in 1989, there was a reunion here for all of the students who had been here and were around. And these are the students whose memories I found. And so I'll read for you because the writing is small. Clayton Horton, Donald Sparrow, George Nickerson, Art Nickerson, Shirley Nickerson, Vernon Nickerson, Sadie Chase, we know her as Sadie Flint, the librarian for many years, Beverly Campbell Plant, whose daughter is here today, Russell Chase, and Bob and Ellie Pearson, brother and sister, who came here in the 30s. That happens to be my mom and uncle. So, they were the contributors who contributed knowingly or unknowingly to tonight's presentation. So our earliest memory is from Nora Sparrow, and she attended this one-room schoolhouse when it was a single-room schoolhouse. It was in 1906. The dates next to their names, the first date is the date they entered first grade, and the second date is when they graduated from 8th grade. So they started, this is from September 1906 then to June of 1914. And she was the one that was the oldest one. I put them in sort of chronological order. She did not have one of the usual teachers, but she remembers Miss Rose Bunnell as her teacher. And in the photograph, Rose Bunnell is the teacher in the upper grade, and right next to her is Nora Sparrow. What she does remember about Miss Keith, this teacher who had the early grades, first and second, and then first, second, third, was that she complimented her writing. And she doesn't know how, she must have seen one of my papers, she said, and thought that I was a good writer. The two buildings, east and west, were here on site, but they were not yet connected to make the three-wing building when she was in here, her memory. The next memory is Clayton Horton. He was also in the class of 1914 as an 8th grader, and his first memory was attending the one-room school. Again, the other two buildings were here, but they were not connected. He remembers adding them on. This is a photo of Miss Keith's class in 1911. And can you see the two little red circles around two people there? That's Clayton Horton on the front row, far second to the end. And behind him, up towards the back, is a little girl called Virginia Nickerson, who became Mrs. Clayton Horton and became a teacher at this school for many, many years. So you'll be hearing about her also. His memory, the one that really stays with him, is about the Spanish influenza in 1918 when he graduated. So this is straight from his tape script, but I will paraphrase. The schools had to close for the influenza, and there was no other mention in the town reports of it. We went through book after book around 1917, 1918, 1919. The only mention was in the superintendent's report, who commented on the absences of the students. When he was a senior, they had missed so much school that if they made them make up that time, it would have gone into the next school year. And so they gave them a test instead, and then allowed those who passed the test to graduate in June on time. And that was his memory. So the next memory is Esther Sparrow. Her married name is Manamon. And we have she has pages and I don't know, 50 or 60 pages of memories. She also has a set of 10 or 12 scrapbooks down in our archives. And they're indexed. And one of the things we want to do in the new wing is to have those scrapbooks available to the public so they can come in and look for themselves at a lot of the things that were going on in the early days in Eastham. So the question asked of her was, what do you remember about school here? And she has a wonderful memory, and it's encapsulated in this photograph. Does anyone know where that photograph is?
Front lawn.
Pardon?
Front lawn, no?
Front lawn? No.
The window.
Not quite.
Locust Road.
Look, well, it was called County Road. It was the main road of Eastham. It's what Locust Road now. There's a little monument to where the town pump used to be. This is the town pump. Looking up the road, you're looking straight at the house next door, the Brewer House. And on the left-hand side of the road, the house directly behind the little jalopy, that's the old town hall, which is the house at the street, the traffic lights, right here behind the big tall trees now. This was the main road of Eastham. And this is Locust going down here, and this is Salt Pond coming in, and then this becomes Nauset. So her memory is that her older sister Polly and she would run ahead. The mother was pushing the younger sister in the baby carriage. She allowed the older girls to run ahead until they got to the horse trough, the pump. And then they had to wait. And the reason they had to wait was that students from far away in Eastham got to school. Their parents brought them on horseback. And there were so many posts with round silver tops all around the schoolyard that the mother was afraid for the young girls and the horses and the confusion that there would be. But what she remembers is the older boys would run and jump those posts on their way into the schoolyard. And she remembers the pot-bellied stove, and she remembers a bucket of water with a ladle that everyone would drink out of, and she said none of us got sick. Some people had memories that the students brought their own cups from home, and then they ladled the water into them in the entryways. She remembers lunchtime games, hopscotch, in and out the window, hilly-eye over. You know hilly eye over? Throwing a ball over the roof and then running around to catch it. She remembers having 5 students in her graduating class. She remembers the horse-drawn barge, which didn't have windows, but it did have curtains. It was a wagon when she started school, and it became a motorized barge by the time she graduated. But we have photos of that because the barge is a shared memory that many people loved. And she remembers Mr. Burgess. Not very many people do remember Mr. Burgess because he was only here for 1 year. He was here in 1916 to 1917. And she said, all the girls, of course, just loved him. He was a handsome man, and he had his hair cut straight across the top. In fact, she said, I was talking to Sadie Flint the other day, and she was saying how she liked him too. All the kids loved him. I know all the girls did. And he started Eastham's very first Boy Scout troop in 1917. And that's the only picture that I could find of him with the boys who were in that first Boy Scout troop. And there are familiar names there, if you can see. Raymond Mayo, Morris Moore, Ernest Moore, Howard Walker, Abbott Knowles, Herman Dill, Carl Gross, that's Mrs. Gould's brother, Clayton Horton, Nate Nickerson, Sidney Horton, and Carol were the two Gross twins. But anyway. So we'll move to Sadie Chase, Sadie Flint. But she had many memories. She began school in 2nd grade because she was so sick in 1st grade. She missed the first few weeks and so then just didn't go to school. But when she entered the next year, they allowed her to go to 2nd grade. She learned penmanship. She learned the Palmer method of penmanship. We did, didn't we? They used paper and pencil. They never used slates. And she remembers in 4th grade, they were allowed to use the ink wells and the pen and ink. And she said that, in capital letters, that was a thrill. She remembered, they asked her a question about how did students dress? And she said the girls, and this is the same class, this is the same photo that Miss Cornell taught. The girls' dresses were wool or cotton, and they were all homemade. Because the only store that sold material for sewing was in Orleans. And you couldn't, it was difficult to get to Orleans in those days. And so all of the dresses were cut down from their older sisters or older parents' dresses to fit the youngsters who came to school. She remembers these separate entrances for girls and boys. They all spoke of this, all of them. The boys' entrance in the schoolroom is coming in, it's on the left-hand side, and the girls' entrance was on the right-hand side. They could sit together in the classroom, but they could not come in the same entrance, ever. And later on, I'll tell it now, Don Sparrow said the first time he ever came in the girls' entrance was when the first schoolroom was renovated, and that was the entryway into the museum. And he walked in and he said he stopped and went, I just came in the girls' entrance. It was just ingrained. She remembers planting trees in the schoolyard. More about that later, because Otto Nickerson has, the schoolmaster, the principal, has that memory also. She remembers learning poems, and many, many of us grew up learning poems. More about that with someone else who really describes it well. The horse-drawn wagon, of course, and the barge in the snow. I'm going to describe the barge in the snow for you, because the students had a short break in the morning, and then they had 1 hour for lunch. And they could go sliding in winter if they had their sleds with them. So Jim Brewer was the driver of the barge, or the wagon, and he allowed them to tie their sleds to the back of that bus on the way to school in the order that he picked them up, so that they could go sliding at lunchtime. There's a picture of the hill later on. And at the end of the day, they would tie their sleds in the order that they were going to be getting off, and he would take them home. And so and wait for them to untie their sleds. And many of the students mentioned their bus drivers or their wagon drivers. And I think we did too. We all know who drove our buses and who took us, places. And I just loved that. Okay. And Sadie found, when she went to Orleans High, that was really frightening. She did not like that at all. She was an only child. She grew up with her grandmother. She came to this school, but when she went to Orleans, she didn't know very many people and just wasn't comfortable. Oh, and this is part of the Palmer handwriting. Beverly Campbell. So here are two pictures of Beverly. This is she was here from 1924 to 1931. This is her class picture when she was in the 6th grade, I believe. There's Otto Nickerson, the teacher, in the back. And Bev, I've circled her picture in the front row. And then later, I think this is her 8th grade picture with 2 of her girlfriends. Bev is the one on the far right there. She remembers Valentine's Day. Everyone remembers Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day was such a celebration in this school. The girls brought in the ingredients to make ice cream. The boys went down to the pond and chipped the ice because it was February, and in February the pond always had ice on it. They drew lots, or tickets, they said, to see who they would give a Valentine to ahead of time, kind of like a secret Santa, because the teachers wanted to ensure that all students would have a Valentine that day. She also remembers May basket parties. And this was, they would make their May baskets, they would secretly take them. She said, we traipsed all around town hanging baskets on doors. And they would knock and then run, and the people would find the May Day basket on May Day. But she never understood how they knew that they were coming, because oftentimes the mother of the house would have cookies or something waiting for them when they got there. She remembers Otto's strap, and she said that her brother and Don Sparrow's brother got it more often than anyone else. This is the barge. Did I mention that for her? I didn't mention that there's no windshield. There is a windshield wiper here, but there's no motor for it. And the driver had to put his hand out the window when it was raining and move the windshield wiper. Don Sparrow was interviewing her, and he interrupted and told her that little bit in her tape script. So I had to include it. Okay, we'll see if there's another slide for Beverly. More memories, here we go. So I mentioned the May basket and the Valentines. She remembers Otto Nickerson's famous strap. More on that later, because everyone mentioned that strap. They either felt it, or they saw it, or they didn't want to. He kept it in his top drawer of his desk. She does remember making geography notebooks, and many of the students did. But there was a family in town, and since they're no longer with us, I can name them. It was Raymond and Irene and Vernon Nickerson. And the students felt it wasn't quite fair, because the older brother was a very good student, and they felt he handed down his geography notebook to his siblings. So it wasn't, and the rest of them didn't have that, option. But there's a wonderful story of a spelling bee, and Beverly turned out to oh, I didn't tell you about her first day of school. I have to go back and tell you that, I'm sorry. She came to school on the first day, and the teacher had made cards for every desk, for every student, with their name on it. And she didn't know how to read. And she was a smart little girl, because what she did was, she looked around at all the desks until everyone had sat down except for one. And then she sat down. And by the time she graduated, this is her graduation, she's honors and scholarship, you know, Beverly Campbell. She was a great speller, and she and Vernon Nickerson, one of the three of the family, were in the Eastham finals of the spelling bee that was held at the town hall. And she lost to Vernon. And they said to her, do you remember what the word was? And she said, English. And she said, I forgot to capitalize it. She said it was so humiliating. He was a year behind me in school, and he was small. So that's Vernon in the middle of the photo. And he went on to represent Eastham in the regional spelling bee that year, held in New Bedford. And we have the sash that he wore to that spelling bee with Eastham on it, proudly representing them, and I know that Bev wanted to be the one wearing that. But it's in the schoolroom in one of the cases, and I love those memories from her. Don Sparrow. Donald Sparrow was one of the Sparrow family. He was a president of the Historical Society here. He's a writer and author. You may have read his books growing up in Eastham about his brothers. And he's given talks and presentations. I'm going to use his words because they're much more eloquent than mine. The East Wing, when I went to school in 1926, housed grades 1 and 2, and Miss Florence Keith was the teacher. She had been there since 1906, and she retired in 1938. She was a wonderful woman and looked much like Eleanor Roosevelt, with the protruding front teeth and the lovely, lovely smile. Miss Keith gave me a double promotion from grade 1 to 3. One of the problems of this was I only had 1 year of her. The practice, actually, of giving double promotions was really quite common in those days. And Dawn says the promotion saved me from being bored, but also pushed me ahead to a class where I was smaller, less mature, both socially and intellectually, than my classmates. Beverly also was double promoted, and I know that Norma Acorn, mother of one of my friends, was double promoted 3 times. But they explain how that happens, and it's coming up. Dawn goes on. Here's Virginia Horton, Virginia Nickerson, who married Clayton Horton. She was a teacher for a long time. He said grades 3, 4, and 5 were in the West Wing, and Mrs. Virginia Horton was the teacher. There were 4 in my 3rd grade class. Mrs. Horton was a short, kind of plump, smiling, sweet lady. She wore her hair in a bun hairdo, with the bun at the back. I get thinking, where else? It's a guy writing this. She always used the bun to store her extra pencils. I thought the pencils sticking out of the bun gave her a jaunty appearance. I remember very little about the 3 years in her room. Most of my recollections of that period have to do with recess and playtime. And then he went on. Grades 6, 7, and 8 We're in the present schoolhouse building, and he was giving this, he was writing this in the 80s, so he's talking about the schoolroom. Mr. Otto Nickerson was the teacher, as well as principal of all 8 grades. He was the teacher from September 1918 until June 1919, and then again from September 1924 until June 1962. And I was lucky enough to be in that 1962 class with Otto Nickerson, the final class that he taught before he retired. And one of the reasons he retired, 2 of his good friends, Ralph Chase and Fred Jewell, were throwing around the idea of starting a historical society. And he couldn't do it while he was principal and teaching. And so he retired and put all of his energies into the school, but in a new way for the museum. And I just love that. Here's a description by Don. He was a tall, handsome man with craggy features, looking something like Abraham Lincoln. He wore a pompadour, which accentuated his height. He must have been 6'2" or 6'3". He pretended to be a strict disciplinarian. He kept a strap in the top right-hand drawer of his desk. When one of us did something which displeased him, he called us up to the front of the room, told us to hold out a hand, and when we did that, he would whack it with the strap. He gave quite a lick, too. So I'm moving on to some of Don's memories. Rhythm band. One of Miss Keith's hobbies was music. He says, I think she played the cello, and she participated in the Cape Cod Symphony Orchestra and encouraged all of her students to take up some musical instrument. We had a percussion band when I was in grade 1, and I played a triangle, block, cymbals, chimes, whatever we could hit. And this is a rhythm band, not in his class. I couldn't find one of his class, but I love this photo of the little ones playing their instruments. He has other memories. Salt Pond. In the springtime, Mr. Nickerson would occasionally take the students at lunchtime down to Salt Pond to swim. Also, some of us went down to Minister's Pond for a quick swim. He also remembers the poems and the geography scrapbooks, and he gives a few more details on those. As part of English class, Mr. Nickerson insisted that we memorize poems. In order to pass the course, we had to stand up and recite our poems. In geography class, the big project was assembling a scrapbook with pictures that illustrated people and practices from around the world. He says, I remember one very bright family in town, and this is where I already shared this, that he thought the older kids, brothers and sisters, handed them down, and they had an unfair advantage over others who were starting from scratch. Another Dawn memory, the separate entrances. This is a lunchtime photo that shows the older boys at lunch, and they're hanging around the older boys' entrance. And he also speaks of the games that they played. And these are some. They started out with clay marbles, but then glass marbles came along, and they played a game called Glassies, where they would throw it against the side of the building, and then it would bounce off, and you tried to hit somebody else. But Prisoner's Base, Hilly Hi-Ho again, jumping rope, and the sledding in the winter. Russell Chase lived right across the street. He has a memory poem. It's a different way of sharing memories. He's written a 36, 40-page book. It's sketches and memories of growing up in Eastham and at what he called the village school. He learned about anonymous names when they were studying literature. So he signed his book J something, JRC, but it wasn't James Joseph Russell Chase. So no one knew who the author was of it. But I'm going to read a little bit from his foreword because it encapsulates everything that I think it's the reason we're here this evening, trying to understand a little bit of the past. He said, Memories, his book, attempts to point out in little poems or sketches some of the many qualities that were brought into focus or molded, or trained and taught by the country schoolmaster who had sufficient time, energy, patience, inspiration, devotion to God and man to encourage and inspire his students to bring forth the best in each, and to show where these beginnings led in adult life and thought world, childhood memories, and memories of later educational experiences, the roots of which stem back to the village school. So I've chosen to share two of his short poems, one to Virginia Horton and one to George Hardwick. This is the one for Virginia. A seed fell upon fertile ground. One other teacher filled my years, my days at the village school. I remember how she used to walk for health, being an example of what she taught. Action, not just talk. One day she said, "There's nothing new under the sun." Although she didn't know it, my curiosity in philosophy had just begun. And the following goes to show it. A thought that traveled mightily from Kierkegaard to Sartre to Freud, Adler, Jung, and Fromm, to Buddha, Christ, and Zen, then to Allah, and on to God Almighty. And George Hardwick was not a teacher here. He was the custodian. He has a poem about George, and he came in at 5 a.m. George fired the stove at 5 a.m., chomping on his chew. If memory serves, I now relate, he was doing some cussing too. And how we loved it. And the one, Merry Christmas, George, wherever you may be now. This is a memory that came from Christmas. The teachers and the custodian all came in early and put a Christmas tree in every single classroom and decorated it, and a big old pine tree out in the yard also. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful poem. These are titles of the poems of the memories. The Halloween, that one's hysterical. Christmas at the village school, the assembly room, Valentine, the chapel in the pines. One of my dreams, one of my goals is to publish this, either orally, if I could find someone who could read it, it would be wonderful, and do an oral keepsake of it, or both, written also. Robert Pearson, Uncle Bob. He was in the last graduating class from this particular school, the class of 1936, along with Russell Chase. He loved the drum and bugle corps. He's front row first in this photo. He loved the marching band. Besides music, because, I don't know if this was done every year, but in the archives, we found a file of letters written from students, by students, to their teacher, Mr. Nickerson. And it was their final assignment. And the final assignment was what they hoped to do in life. And Uncle Bob said, I'm writing a letter telling what I shall do in life. He says, I'll be 18 when I graduate from high school, if all goes well. After that, I'd like to do something to help others. So I think I'll join the United States Coast Guard. I would like to get on a station with a lot of excitement and action. And then it goes on, he'd done his research, he knew how much pay they got per month and what the term was and everything like that. So he got an A- because he said you receive instead of one receives. And in which, and something else. But guess what? Uncle Bob joined the Coast Guard after high school, and this is his Coast Guard photo. And so I loved that because he actually realized his dream that he had, and we have all of that class, that particular class, we have all their letters. So it'll be interesting to see. Eleanor Pearson, my mom. Mom and Uncle Bob were state kids, and in many of our photos, they're identified, but then there are blanks, and it just says state kid. State kid. Otto speaks of them also, and I'll be reading more about it, but there was a little bit of a stigma. And Mom played the violin. She's right below Mr. Nassi in the orchestra. And what I want to focus on here, she has no idea, but I found the report cards for all of the students from the early 1900s through when they left. They're in ledgers that the teachers had to fill in and put their grades. And because I was part of the 1962 graduating class, Otto's final class, we had a school reunion in honor of 60 years in honor of Otto. And so we had lunch at the elementary school, and then since our parents had all gone to school here and marched down there, we left there and marched up here. And I had printed out their report cards and put them on the desks in the schoolroom and said, if you recognize any name on any desk, please sit there. And 11 of our parents had gone to this school. And so I had all of their grades from 1 through 8. Your dad had whooping cough as a young boy, and he went up to Brockton to school for a while, or somewhere up there, and the teacher wrote on the report card, Arthur returned, the worse for wear. And they promoted students, and they double promoted, and they took them back. They demoted them, and then they promoted them on trial. It was really quite something. But they also graded them, and this is what they graded them on. Health habits, industry, reliability, cooperation, thrift, courtesy. Reading, language, spelling, arithmetic, geography, history, and writing. And drawing, music, instrumental, and then they took your weight. It was during the Depression, and they needed to know what they didn't weigh very much, let me tell you. One of Mom's favorite memories, I think it's the one we heard the most about, was packing up from this school and marching down to the new school. And I gave a talk a few weeks ago at the Council on Aging, and someone in the audience said, my dad remembers marching from that school to the new school. Next slide. There they are. Now this is a shared memory, but they're different memories. And you'll see clearer pictures of these a little bit later with Mary. This is Otto, you can tell. He's the very tall teacher. All the students in this photo have their books in their arms. The desks had already been moved down the way. The students in this photo is the marching band, and they led the way with their instruments. And Otto's memory of that is that it was Miss Keith's drum and bugle corps, and the young men in the drum and bugle corps led them. But I think that's conflated with something else. So, but that's the memory they all remember, the marching band. And this next slide shows the final graduating class of 1936. When they marched, it was February 1st, 1937. And this was in the paper. 11 pupils will bid farewell to the old Eastham Grammar School this year, the last class to be graduated from the school, which is to be replaced by a modern structure this summer. And then the students who were in that class. The final memories are from Otto Nickerson, the beloved teacher and mentor of so many of us through the years. So here he is, not as a very young man, that was the previous photo, but here he is. I'm going to read from his interview that he gave in the 80s. And he was asked, what were the surroundings like? Everything was open around the school. You could see practically over to the ocean. You could see the beautiful view from the schoolhouse door, just looking over Salt Pond, over the marsh, onto the ocean. Quincy Shaw used to have his golf course there. And I remember I used to excuse the boys in the upper grades quite often when he'd bring men down from Boston for the weekend and they'd play golf. The kids would earn as much as a quarter in an afternoon. And boy, that was big money. And this is a photo of some of the boys that were caddies at the golf course, which it was an 18-hole golf course from the town hall all the way over here across Salt Pond. And that was big money in those days. And Don Sparrow, Bob Pearson, Fenton Sparrow. There's a whole set of these photos. They're wonderful. And they're in the Earl Warren room of the town hall where you go in and vote. When you go in, stop a moment and take a look. They're just fabulous, of a different era, a different time. So that was the school and golf. The catalpa trees. He says, the question was, around the edge of the schoolhouse, there were a number of catalpa trees. And he said, did the students plant them? And Otto Nickerson said, yes, they did. I don't know, he said, whether it was the Audubon Society or where, but the state gave a catalpa tree to every child in Massachusetts at that time for the youngsters to take home. Now, we've got catalpa in our backyard, and I don't know where it came from, but maybe. There were a few trees that were older, and we set them out on the school grounds after each student got them. And it was just that one year, and we had a little ceremony. He remembers the city kids, and he describes his strap. He says, we had quite a number of youngsters that were wards of the city of Boston, and people in town would take them in to board. My mother. They got $3 a week if they were white, and they got $3.50 if they were black. And people often come in and look at the photos in the room and they say, did you have a lot of black students here, because in every class picture you'll see some. And not grew up in Eastham, but sent down here from the city. And the question was, and you taught these children? And Mr. Nickerson said, oh yes. And usually the ones that were brought in from Boston were the ones that I had to attend to occasionally with that little strap, which my father had presented me with when I first took up teaching. He cut off a piece from an old trace from one of his old harnesses, perhaps a foot long, about 2 inches wide, and about ½ an inch thick. Let me tell you, if you had that once, you just didn't look forward to having it a second time. These kids that came from the city, sort of, well, they looked down on the other kids. So of course I had to get them in line. And I thought, my thought had been, because no one ever remembered their names in the photos, that it was kind of the other way around, that they had been. So who knows, they're memories, but the memories are different and the perspectives too. So he was asked what was his discipline like. And he said it wasn't too bad at all. I do remember one day, it was the beginning of winter and the ice in the pond down back was frozen over. And I told the boys I didn't want them to go down because I didn't think it was safe. And I was busy putting things on the blackboard and so forth during the noon hour. And some of them skipped down there on the ice. And I found out about it. Somebody came tattling to me. So I went out and I shouted for them to come up. And when they came, they went in the door past me. And I either gave them a whack or I kicked them, and they landed in the schoolroom on their hands and knees on all four. So many kids after that came up and spoke to me and said they would never forget that day when they went down on the ice and I had told them not to go. So lessons learned. But Mr. Nickerson had so many traditions and celebrations. And these are some that came up over and over in the tape scripts. The Valentine's Day, the May Day, Memorial Day. These are photos of the very first Memorial Day march to the cemetery that Mr. Nickerson started in 1931 and continues to this day. The swimming days. We thought we were so special he took our class down swimming. He did it all, you know, who knew? Nantucket graduation trips, wonderful photos and the times they had, but no time tonight. 4th of July parades, Veterans Day, Christmases, soup kitchens. The older girls, during the Depression, with help from ladies from the town, served hot soup at lunch so kids would have something hot. The 4-H club was started, and my favorite minor maid, reading aloud. He read aloud to us every single day. Marcus Aurelius Fortunatus Tidd, Mark Tidd. Never forget that book. Anyway, Otto has retired. He retired in 1962. We have a desk that he bought up here in 1924 from Sears and Roebuck. This desk has 55 different lessons in it. This one is on birds and how to identify them and how to identify their eggs and where to find them. So the school's loss at his retirement was our gain here. And Mary is going to explain just how that happened.
We're now changing gears a bit here, away from the individual memories, but to the memories about how we have brought this building back to life. The memories of Eastham school days did not die when the students left the building. Like all of us, memories from our youth are among the fondest that we share. They live on. For the schoolhouse, they needed to be resurrected from a derelict building left to rot in the woods, as you can see in this photo, far cry from what it looks like today. So the next phase in the life of the little schoolhouse took the building from ruin to rescue to a series of restorations that have renewed it as a repository of these wonderful memories that Marca talked about for future generations. Marca mentioned when the schoolhouse was decommissioned in February of 1937, and the kids picked up their books and marched down the road to the new elementaries led by the school band. The building was sold that year. The original schoolhouse was rented for a time. The two added wings were removed. One building became a house down the street. The timbers from a third are reputed to have been used in other houses, like everything is repurposed here in Eastham. In the early 1940s, the Eastham Volunteer Firemen's Association held whist card games to raise money to buy the deed to the old building. So they used the building that they bought, the old schoolhouse, until the early 50s, when the town's first firehouse was completed. The school building then fell into disrepair and actually was in danger of being torn down. In 1965, the newly formed Eastham Historical Society rescued the remains of that building. As Fred Jewell, one of the organizers of the society, along with Otto Nickerson and Mr. Chase, remembered, the old house of learning stood in a sad state of affairs. The roof leaked badly, the windows were broken and boarded up, the floor was rotted through in places, and the grounds were overgrown with weeds, shrubs, and trees. The signboard announcing the restoration was the only bright spot on the premise. So members undertook its restoration, and the schoolhouse opened its doors to the public as a museum in July of 1966. The community generously donated many artifacts and memories from their lives in Eastham to build a collection to be preserved for Eastham's future. The single-room schoolhouse served as a museum for over 40 years. As the collection of artifacts grew, the museum was bursting at the seams. Eileen Siebold, our president, remembers seeing the archives stacked to the rafters, wondering if it would fall down on her as she walked through the museum. One publication said the Helter Skelter Museum resembled a swap shop. So you can understand, and these pictures show you how really congested this one room, what one room was. So at the start of the 21st century, members began planning to restore the museum to its historic footprint. The first step was to recreate the second wing, this one we're in. The first step, around 2005, Surrey's plans came alive. The ambitious restoration unfolded over several years. To begin with, it entailed actually raising the original school building on stilts to dig a full basement for a temperature-controlled archives and storage. A lobby was added between the original building and the new wing. That second wing was outfitted for displays, including cases from the old Brackett General Store, which still surround you today. But the crowning glory of the restoration project was recreating the period schoolroom in the original building. While many of the desks had to be obtained elsewhere, because the desks were moved to the other school, some items from the original school, including Otto Nickerson's desk, are now in that room. Not just this desk, but his desk that he taught from. The grand opening in July of 2008 was a landmark occasion for society members and the Eastham community. I bet some of you were there then. So now we come to the third wing. So the second wing was no sooner underway when members began to talk about the restoration of the full three-wing schoolhouse. In 2016, some preliminary plans were developed. In 2023, an anonymous donation spurred the development of a plan and the fund to build the final edition. In May 2024, A community preservation grant provided funding for much of the project, and other donations allowed us to start construction in October of last year. Construction moved along at a really good pace, from foundation work to raising the walls, and in just a few short months. By the winter, the building was enclosed, and work on the interior began. By April of this year, the finished interior emerged as the light and airy space behind you. And just last week, we celebrated the addition of the new wing and a ribbon cutting ceremony. Now the interior work continues. As we mentioned at the beginning of this program, we're using the opportunity of the new wing to reimagine how we use the entire museum space. And as we envision this museum, we want to add more interactive and accessible features, technology, as Marca mentioned, about computer access to genealogy and historic research, a media center for all of these wonderful oral histories, a virtual teacher welcoming visitors to the classroom, and more hands-on exhibits, and even some selfie stations using old photos. While we are working on developing these new exhibits and fundraising, we're using our extensive archives to make new memories, like by displaying them and the stories they tell and letting people handle them, like the hands-on exhibit of the Eastham baseball in the room behind you. Creating new interest in our collections by rearranging displays, providing their stories from the history of Native peoples to kids' toys and technology innovations. We continue to work to bring our history to life in new and interesting ways. If you would like to help, there are some envelopes on your chairs for contributions, just like church. You can hand them to one of our EHS volunteers as you leave, if you choose. But seriously, we really appreciate your support. Thank you for being with us tonight. And Marca and I are happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
What is the tree that we see through the window above you? Is that a
Cattell.
Cattell?
That is, they're around the premises, right?
Okay.
That was one of those that was planted, what year was it? 1911?
1911 was the first Arbor Day when they planted trees, but these, we don't know. There was no date that Mr. Nickerson remembered, but it was, so it could have been, you know.
Okay.
One final reminder that we're having a raffle in the back of the lovely paintings the Eastham Painters Guild donated for us being able to fund more features in the building. So you can buy one ticket for $5 or 3 for $10. It's a real deal. So stop and see Mary Beth. Bye.
And on your way, please stop by the new wing.
Yes, please do.